we at UTEC are very proud to have a partnership with IMD to build capabilities around digital transformation. So Michael, welcome. It's an honor to have you here with us. And I wanted to start this conversation. I know you've been at IMD, and you yourself have been doing a lot of work lately, first around digital disruption and the importance of having this in mind. Then also doing some work around digital transformation and how the how, right? The question of how to execute digital transformation. And then I know you lately are doing some research around what skills are needed for digital transformation. So this is an interesting sequence that probably has gone in parallel with how people have been changing their minds and realizing the importance of this phenomenon. Also, please, Mike, welcome. And why don't you start by telling us a little about your work?
Sure. Before I start, muy buenos días a todos y todas. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm very happy about our cooperation, and I welcome any questions or comments that any of you have. So you're right. I've been studying digital transformation now for quite a few years. You know, when we started looking at this, I mean, we probably 7-8 years ago, and really then people were interested in what it was. You know, we're focusing on the what around digital, helping people understand the technologies and how they worked and how they could potentially impact their companies, but people weren't necessarily ready to do anything. And then that switched, of course, and then it became more about the how, helping companies to actually execute. And now more recently, it's been, how do we fix what we screwed up? It's really difficult. These transformations are really tough. So we're helping organizations now to kind of do it the second time, because the first time it didn't work out. We've been doing work over the years, as you mentioned. It's changed a bit. We're working through a 5-book series. So a series of 5 books. The first book was really a strategy book around understanding digital disruption. That was called Digital Vortex. And then we followed that up with an execution book, which is called Orchestrating Transformation. Earlier this year, we released a 3rd book on innovation, so digital innovation, called Alien Thinking. In about 5 weeks, actually, what the date is today, no, it's exactly 1 month, we're releasing another book called Hacking Digital. And this one is a problem-solving book. So all the challenges and problems that you may have faced, all the people here in the session today may be facing, we've identified them, the 30 biggest ones, and then we've kind of provided solutions to each one. So that's coming out in a month. And then the last book in the series, which will come out hopefully next year, is more about the individual level. What does it mean for you as a leader or a manager to be effective and successful in a digital age? So we're taking it from kind of the industry level to the organizational level. We're going to end at that individual level. That's the plan, at least.
That sounds like an interesting research path, very complete. Now, I've read you say this and heard you this in some conversations, say most of digital transformation efforts fail, right? Actually, it's not most, it's like a large majority of transformation efforts fail. So you're a leader in a company now, like, why take this risk, right? Particularly when if you're in media, you probably take the risk, right? Because the industry is changing and it's very evident, right? But if you're in mining, in construction, right, in some industry where you don't have necessarily digital products, why take this risk? Why take a risk that has like a 90% chance of failure?
Yeah, we heard all over the place that the rate of failure was high. So we decided why don't we go out and measure it? We'll actually try and see. So we collected data on that to try and measure the success rate of digital transformation initiatives. Plus, there's a bunch of work out there done by other academics and consulting companies. And so we took all that and we kind of put it all in a big model and we crunched the data. And the number that came out was 87. So 87% of these digital transformation efforts fail to meet objectives. And this, we can talk about the reasons for that. But to answer your question, you know, if the success rate is so low, why bother, right? Why do it? And it's a good question. And the advice that I would provide, I would give people is, if you don't need to transform digitally, don't do it, right? It's hard. It's expensive. It takes your energy, you know, and it's quite likely you're going to fail. So if you don't need to do it, don't do it. But the problem is that there's very few companies left where they don't have a choice, right? As you said, in the media, you know, any of those industries for which the core product can be digitized, like communications, you know, media, financial services, you know, retail, any of these, you know, you have no choice. But even many others, consulting, professional services, you know, education, the industry that we're in, you really don't have any choice either. And then you have the few on the edge, right? The heavy manufacturing, mining, resources, natural resources, maybe utilities. But even in those cases, I think the imperative to transform is high. The product may not be digital, but how you distribute the product, how you communicate and engage with customers is digital. So when I look at you know, we have multiple programs that we offer on digital for executives, and hundreds of them come every year. And at the beginning, you know, it was the telcos and the banks and whatever. But today it's, you know, we're just as likely to have somebody from a mining company, a natural resource company, a winemaking, you know, a company, a restaurant, you know, that don't seem on the surface to be very digital, but nevertheless are feeling a lot of pressure to do things differently and to use digital tools. So I'd say, unless you're in the business of painting nails, basically you're going to have to take the risk. But fortunately, the good news is that 87% failure rate doesn't need to be that high. There are concrete things that companies can do to increase the chances of success.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to ask you next, right? Because I mean, 87% is an average. There's probably some companies that are doing it right and others that are doing it wrong. But it would be great to have someone who has researched this to tell us, so how do I do it right? And what do I need to avoid, no? In order to reduce that percentage, right? I would love that 87% to be a much lower number. How do I do that?
I mean, that's a great question, right? And it's the answer to that question is a lot longer than that time we have together, right, today. But there are a few, you know, relatively high-level simple things that companies can try to do to avoid that failure rate, to mitigate the risk. I mean, you know, very simply from the start, choosing the right objective for your transformation is really important. You know, you got to make sure you know why you're doing it. And if that why reason is not good, you're probably going to fail. And one of the most common, maybe the most common reason or objective for transformation is the most simple one. We want to be more digital, right? We're at digital maturity. There's a 5-point scale. We're 2. We want to go to 4, right? And that's our objective. That's the objective of our digital transformation, is for us to improve our digital maturity, become more digital. And it sounds like a very reasonable objective, right? Why wouldn't you want to be more digital? But in fact, it's a very dangerous objective. Because what does it mean? It means that you go out and it means that you invest in a lot of capabilities, tools, technologies, and you get in, you know, consultants to help you and so forth. And then you build all these digital capabilities, but it doesn't mean you're improving your performance. Right? Often it's the opposite. You're actually spending a lot of energy on the tools and the technologies more so than what you really want to improve, which is your business. So one of the, you know, the little secrets about digital transformation is that, you know, there's this much digital and it's this much transformation. So, you know, starting point, I would say, is create a very clear business-oriented goal. Whether it's improving your revenue, reducing your costs, improving your market share, customer satisfaction, NPS score, employee engagement, whatever, right? And make that the clear goal at the end, and then think of digital as an enabler, as a tool to help you to get there. But it should never be the end objective, right? So that's one simple one that organizations can kind of get their heads around. I think another one, just to give you another, there are many, of course, reasons why these projects fail, but another one is that it's treated as a technology project and sometimes an IT project, right? And clearly there are technology elements, and IT is a very important stakeholder, but it probably shouldn't be leading the digital transformation, because fundamentally a digital transformation normally is about organizational change. And so it's difficult to lead an organizational change from a technology group. So I think those are just two very high level, simple reasons why a lot of these transformation projects fail.
No, and this is an interesting gateway to one other question I wanted to ask you, and that is, what sets off? I mean, you've mentioned this has technology. Technology is an enabler, but it's not a technology project, right? So, what sort of capabilities does your organization need, both as an organization and individually, right, as individual members, in order to deliver digital transformation, right? What sort of capabilities do you think, or have you found, that are critical to reduce this 87% that now I think we all have, like, in our minds is a very big number?
Yeah, fundamentally these transformations are change projects, and so change management is a key skill, and because these, you are changing more than just the technology. Often you're changing processes, and you're changing operating models, and you're changing route to markets. I mean, all these things require change management skills. But the issue I think that we see is that the traditional models of change, the change management models that we all know and love, like Cotter's 8 stages of transformational change, they're very linear, right? You go to step 1, and you go to step 2, and then you step 3, and eventually you get to step 8. And when you get to step 8, that's when you get the benefits. But the problem is, in a fast changing, unpredictable world, you never get through the steps. You never get through them. So maybe you're at step 4 of 8, and then a global pandemic hits, and then you're back to step 1 again, right? So you never. So I think the way you manage change itself needs to change. It must be a lot more dynamic, right? A lot more. So you're orchestrating all the pieces at the same time. It's complex, but I think we don't simply have the time anymore to follow these linear change processes. And by the way, I feel the same thing about the 3-year plan or the 5-year plan. Forget it. It's not working. It doesn't work. I guess a lot of people here, listening, they probably work for companies that have a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan. The problem is that those things just lock you in. And when the environment is as dynamic as it is today, you can't be locked in. You need to be agile and need to be able to change very, very quickly. Thankfully, digital tools and technologies can really help you to do that.
That's great, Mike. And you've opened up 2 topics here that I want to cover that are very interesting. Once you mentioned the pandemic, and that's like the elephant in the room. We'll talk about it later. But now you, just at the end of your phrase, you mentioned a concept, agility, right? Agility is a big buzzword right now. Like, everybody talks about agility, refer to agility in different contexts, in different ways. Like, we don't know anymore what we're talking about sometimes. No? So when you talk about agility and this necessity of the organizations to be agile, what do you mean? What do you mean by it?
It's a great question, right? When it comes to this whole area, there's like a buzzword bingo, right? And these words are getting thrown around. It doesn't help that they're moving in and out of different languages, but even within a single language, you could have a word like agile, and everybody in a meeting says, yeah, we need to be more agile. Okay, they all go off after the meeting, but they all have completely different ideas of what agile means. By the way, it's the same thing with the word digital. Digital is the same problem, right? Everybody talks about digital, but do they all mean the same things? Often not. So when I work with companies, often we spend the first hour at least just trying to clearly define some of these terms: digital, agile, disruption, things like this that are often very, very different interpretations. Agile is one of them, right? So you mentioned that one. For some people, it's the IT development methodology, right? It's an agile way of working, and that's what it means, right? Some people, it's just a synonym, another word for flexibility, right? But for us, actually, it's something more precise. So we did a big project, and we looked at companies that were very agile, and we looked at companies that were not very agile. We tried to understand the difference. And the conclusion we came to, after all kinds of work, all kinds of studying, all kinds of research, was that agility is not one thing at all. And I'm talking here about organizational agility, right? It's not one thing at all. It's actually three separate things, right? And you have to, as a company, you have to be able to do these three things. So the first thing is a sensing capability that we call hyper-awareness, right? So this is this ability to know what's going on in the environment, right? And not just your backyard, but beyond your backyard, emerging competitors, emerging technologies, changes in laws or regulations. I mean, all these things matter. So you need to have this really strong sensing capability. Also internally within the organization, listening to what your employees are saying, your customers. So a really advanced sensing capability we call hyper-awareness. But that's not enough. That's not enough. Just being aware of what's going on is good, but you have to do something with that information. So the second part of agility for us is something we call informed decision making. So it's the translation of that data that you've collected into decisions, right? Evidence-based decisions. And honestly speaking, a lot of companies are really not very good at this. They collect the data, and it sits in a database somewhere. It's not used, right? So it's translating those insights, that data into decisions, but also that's not enough. So there's a third piece, right? And that's the conversion of the decision into some kind of action. Lots of companies make decisions, but then nothing happens. So the third piece of the agility puzzle is something we call fast execution. So it's taking those decisions and then putting them into practice really quickly, right? And when you do that, you learn, right? You see what works and what doesn't work, and that feeds into your hyper-awareness. So it's this kind of cycle: hyper-awareness, informed decision-making, fast execution, like that. And companies that can do this effectively, build these three capabilities, are the ones that are the most agile. So that's what we really mean by agility in an organizational context. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. So I get hyper-awareness, that is this sensitivity you have around the environment. And then you need to take decisions based on data, and then execution, right? That's a whole agility process. Now, we mentioned before we were going to talk about the pandemic, right? As you mentioned, you were doing all this research about disruption, and then companies recognizing the importance of digital transformation, so now they needed more help around how to execute, and then the pandemic hit, right? Yeah. And then the first question people ask about this is, I mean, is this something that it's going to be just temporary? People realize, oh, digital now becomes big, and then now this kind of the pandemic ends, hopefully soon, and then everything comes back to normal. Have you seen really big mind shifts? What's your perception about what's going on, and how that is going to impact transformations in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I read a couple of things recently that kind of were a little bit scary. And one was about the Black Death, which was a pandemic in the 1300s. And that one lasted 300 years. So every generation, they would kind of, they would get better, and then the next generation would get it. So, and I also read that the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic is still with us. When we have the flu, when we get the flu today, it's actually a genetically granddaughter or great granddaughter or something like that of that one. So that didn't actually go away. So there's a couple of scary things. But of course, this pandemic, COVID-19, it will ease. We will get past it. We will move on. and thankfully, it's taken a lot longer than we all expected, but it will move on. But it doesn't mean that that type of disruptive event will disappear, right? So, next time it may not be a pandemic, but it may be a huge terrorist event. It may be a natural disaster. It may be a global financial crisis. It's something we're going to see more and more and more of these things. There's no question that that's the case. So I think getting back to your question, right? The pandemic. Some organizations have done better than others. Now, I just told you about agility, right? The importance of agility. What's interesting in the pandemic is that agility was extremely important capability for companies to respond. However, plenty of agile companies failed, right? So companies that were good at hyper awareness, informed decision making, fast execution, they did all that and they still failed. So the pandemic taught us that there's more to success from an organizational point of view than just agility. Agility is important. You want to be agile, but it's not enough. It's not enough when you're in a very disruptive environment like we have with the pandemic. Why? I'll tell you why. Pandemics are big, right? If you're agile, what it means when you're agile is that you can avoid threats, right? You can sidestep them. You can move quickly to get out of the way. And that's true for most threats. But when you have a threat as big and powerful as a global pandemic, it doesn't matter how agile you are, you're going to get hit, right? You are going to get hit. And a lot of companies that were agile, they were just too small, not diversified enough, not capitalized enough, or whatever it was, and they went bankrupt. So what we've learned actually from the pandemic is that, when you're really trying to succeed and not just survive, but thrive in an extremely disruptive environment, that you need not only to be agile, you need to also be robust, right? So you can take hits because you're going to take damage. There's no question, but you want to take less damage than some of your competitors. And this is interesting because suddenly it challenges a lot of the things we just accepted about good management. For example, good management means that your companies are optimized and efficient, right? So we focus on making lean operations, lean value chains. We reduce waste and we eliminate waste and all that, and we become optimized. The problem with being optimized is it makes you vulnerable because you get one cut, right? You've gone down from 6 factories to 1. Great. What happens if that factory closes, right? You used to source from 3 vendors. Now you source from 1. It's in China. China's closed. You're in trouble, right? So in fact, companies that have done well in the pandemic have accepted the fact that they need a little bit of slack, right? They need a little bit of inefficiency. And that makes them robust. So you want to be agile, but you also need to be robust. And the third thing is you need to be able to accelerate really quickly. So when you come back faster than your competitors, and much of that is cultural. So the companies that have done well in the pandemic, there's a few examples out there. The ones that really have been quick, they've been agile, but they've also been robust, and they've been able to accelerate quickly from the hit. So I think that the pandemic has taught us a lot, and I think digital transformation now is not just about becoming more agile; it's about becoming more agile and becoming robust.
That's interesting. And we have a question from someone in the audience saying, he's talking about an article you wrote back in 2017 with Rainer Neubauer, Redefining Leadership for a Digital Age. And he mentions, you talked about 4 characteristics of agile leaders. They had to be humble, adaptable, visionary, and engaged. And the question is basically, how has this held up over time and throughout the pandemic? Have you changed your mind about this based on recent events?
So thanks for the question, Mark. Our thinking has evolved actually from that. And again, we learned from the pandemic. So at the time, the article, and it was, we wrote a few things on this, talking about new forms of leadership, right? So you have the traditional leader, maybe hierarchical, intuitive, right? Intuition, sticking to his or her decisions, makes the decision, then sticks to his or her guns, good at telling. And we kind of challenge that and with this have model, right? That successful leaders in a digital age are humble, right? They don't need to know the answer because there's no way in a fast changing world that the leader is going to be the one with the answer, right? It could be a junior employee. So humble enough to accept the fact that they don't have all the answers, adaptable, changeable, visionary, and engaged. Our thinking now is a little bit different. So we still believe there's this kind of traditional leader archetype, right? The top-down hierarchical leader. And then you have the new style of leader, the humble leader, the one who listens more than tells, the power sharer versus the power holder, right? The data-driven leader versus the intuition-driven leader, right? So we have these archetypes. But we no longer believe that the new one is always better than the old one. Right? We no longer believe that because let's look at the pandemic, right? Suddenly you're in a global pandemic. Data-driven doesn't work. You have no data. You don't know what's going on. It's good, nobody knows what's going on. So there's no point using data to make decisions. Intuition becomes more important, right? In a crisis like the pandemic, you can't spend weeks listening to everybody to try to understand the different points of view. You got to make a decision now. Right? Because next week they're going to close your company unless you change your path, right? So you have to make decisions quickly. You have to be top down for a short period of time and so forth. So there are times when the traditional leader archetype is actually more valuable and important than the emerging leader archetype. So it's not about one being better than the other, it's about balancing them. So and when we think about each of us, and Enrique, you and everybody listening here, we all are naturally on one side or the other, right? We're naturally power sharers or power holders. We're naturally tellers or listeners. We're naturally intuition-based or fact-based, right? And what we used to do when we taught leadership was we'd help you to figure out where your position was, what your behaviors are, and then we try to make the best version of you, right? So we'd figure out, Enrique, where you sit between the new and the traditional, and then we'd say, we're going to make the very best, we're going to make you the very best version of you. We're going to optimize your skills and capabilities as a leader. Now, our view is that's actually counterproductive, because we're going to be faced as leaders with so many different types of situations that we have to increase our range. So it's not about optimizing your leadership sweet spot, to use that term, the sweet spot, but it's more about creating a sweet range. So broadening the skills, capabilities, and behaviors that you have as a leader, so that you can respond to many, many, many different situations, right? Because the world is going to throw lots of different things at us, and we have to be able to respond in many, many different ways. So it's a completely different kind of perspective about what makes a good leader, right? In a very, because, and this is the last thing I'll say, then I'll get to the next question. Many of the leaders from the last 5 years are kind of what we call peacetime leaders. The economy was relatively good. There wasn't a lot of crazy change going on. It felt like it was changing a lot, but really it was relatively stable. So you had a lot of these growth-oriented leaders, right? Peacetime leaders. Suddenly you get a pandemic, and it's war. And these peacetime leaders, these growth-oriented visionary types, right? They really struggled, because suddenly you have to be very tactical, very detail-oriented, and so they didn't have the range in order to be able to make the switch.
This is very interesting. So that gives me again, I will get away to something more contextual from the region, Latin America. So besides the pandemic, Latin America is seeing some political changes, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the business community on what's going to happen. no?
Yeah.
But this is happening in the middle of a pandemic in an interconnected world where you need to compete regardless of what's happening in your region, right? So leaders are asking themselves, how much should they wait, right, before investing in these ambitious transformation efforts? Because there's uncertainty, right? And the risk is higher because of this uncertainty. So what to do, right? And this is a very big question, right? And, but I mean, leaders are facing this question right now: is should I invest in this like risky situation, or should I wait? How should I go about this in my thinking?
Don't wait. Don't wait. Don't wait. You know, what are you waiting for anyway? You're waiting for the world to go back to the way it was? It's just not going to happen, right? You know, one crisis will be resolved, another one will come up. You know, don't wait. You'll just wait forever. And you know, as I mentioned, we go through these periods of relative stability and then short periods of intense change. And it's during those short periods of intense change where the next generation of companies are born, right? The leaders in the next decade, they're being born right now. And the same thing is the leaders of the last decade, right now is when they're dying, right? So you know, because the pandemic has done so much to switch our mindsets, you know, of what's possible. There's an openness to change now that doesn't usually exist. So I think it's a very, very good time at the moment to invest, you know, to jump out there, to do things you don't normally do, to take advantage of that short period of instability to kind of capture a new land, you know, create new value for customers. But you know, if you wait until things get relatively stable again, somebody else would have already come in. You'll be waiting. Honestly, my personal view, you can't wait. You've got to go now.
That's great. Now, thinking about the region, no? We're thinking about Latin America now. And when thinking about digital transformation, I mean, we have medium-sized companies that are seen as large companies in Latin America. Maybe they're leaders in their countries, even regional leaders, but they don't have the size of Walmart, Cisco, right? They're relatively smaller companies. And thinking about their digital transformation strategy, should they be waiting to see what leaders are doing? Should they be taking a very particular transformation effort, like designed for their own selves? Because I mean, industries typically you think about good practices, no? And when you see good practices, you see leaders and what they're doing, and then you follow if you're not the largest one, no? And then if you don't have a lot of resources to invest. So if you're like a regional leader, a large company, but maybe not as large as a company as the ones that are making the big investments right now in transformation, what's the play there? What would you advise those leaders in this context?
So I think that's actually a great position to be in, a really good position. You know, because you already have size, you know, not the same as the big global giants, but you have size locally and maybe regionally. And what you can do, we talked before about the importance of hyper awareness, right? You know, is Amazon going to be super interested in Peru? Well, eventually, maybe, right? But in the short term, there are bigger fish to fry, right, in other parts of the world. So it doesn't mean you can't very carefully look at what Amazon does, understand their business model, understand their strengths and their weaknesses, and apply something similar. Right? There's lots of examples now globally where the big digital giants are not succeeding because local players are much more attuned, much more aware, much more able to meet local needs, right? Because generally the big companies, they're standardized, right? You take it or leave it. You know, so I just before I joined you, I was virtually running a session in Russia. In Russia, you have these local digital giants that just learned from the global players and just replicated locally. And they did it very well because they really understand the local Russian consumer. And it's the same thing in Peru, and it's the same thing in other countries. I think there's you know, the fast follower model is a very effective one, right? You just got to be fast, right? You don't need to be first, you got to be fast. Fast, not first. That's okay. You don't need to be first because somebody else somewhere else is going to be first. That's fine. But if you're not going to be first, you better be fast. Right. So I actually believe that the fast follower model can be very, 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 very effective. Sure, you can try to be first if you want, but you don't need to in most cases.
Mm-hmm. And there's another question from an audience member. She's asking, you talked about robustness and agility, and we've talked about going through the pandemic, but there's probably a skill gap there, right? There's organizations. I mean, how do you see? The question is essentially, how do you see the future in terms of the skills the organizations are going to need and the skills they currently have? No, is there a big gap there? How they need? Do you see them covering? How should they be covering those gaps?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good question. It's a very, very relevant question, and the talent gap is big at the moment, and organizations need to address that, right, by training and retraining, right, and the training depends on the type of stakeholder, right? It's not everybody. You can't just have one size fits all, because you have some people who are much more advanced than others. You have digital natives that get it, but maybe don't understand the business. You have digital immigrants that are comfortable with technology, but it's never natural, right? Then you have digital ignorance who really don't like the technology, that needs, so there's different approaches that you need depending on the stakeholders. But yes, absolutely. Absolutely, there's a big challenge for organizations. I would also say, and you and I are both in the education space, right? That are largely, I mean, UTEC is the exception, right? But our schools are failing us. Our schools, our education systems globally are failing us in giving our young people the skills and knowledge they need to succeed. I firmly believe that. There's still, most education systems are still in the mode of, giving knowledge, right? So here's a teacher with knowledge, here's a student who doesn't have the knowledge, and the information goes from the teacher to the student. We're done, right? We give knowledge. Knowledge is no longer a differentiator in many sectors. It's not, because you'll never know as much as Wikipedia. You'll never know as much as Google. You can't compete on knowledge as much anymore. What you compete on is how you interpret knowledge, analyze knowledge, make decisions from knowledge, apply knowledge into practical context. But our education system doesn't do any of that. It doesn't. It's just, here's a test. Let's see how many of these facts that you remember. Honestly, those are not the skills that companies need today. So I think, the education system should be doing that. It's not doing it. So it means that organizations, unfortunately, have to do it themselves.
Yes. And the pandemic has been kind of a forced context to learn that, right? We've all learned things through experience that we didn't probably learn through training programs or at school. So yes, for sure. And then I had one other question around this, the importance, going back to the importance of digital transformation and how companies execute successfully a digital transformation. That is, and this is also a question that leaders ask, right? Consultants have always told me I need to stick to my core, right? And like extract value from the core of my business and try to extract the most value before moving to new horizons, right? Now, I don't feel that comfortable with digital transformation, right? This is kind of going outside of my core capabilities. Isn't this a reason to stop me from doing it, of taking these initiatives? Like, I'm still leveraging my core. Why should I risk and go outside of my strength jumping to this?
There are broadly two ways that digital tools and technologies can create value for companies, right? We refer to them as digitization and digital transformation. We see these two different things. Digitization is when you take something that's analog and you make it digital. You take something on paper and you put it online. You take a process which is manual and you digitize it. So digitization. This is incremental, right? But it doesn't mean it's not valuable. In fact, most of the benefits of digital tools and technologies today, most of them, we estimate around 80% of them are actually digitization. So there's actually nothing wrong with this. You can go through a digital transformation, a digital program, a digital project, which is really focused on efficiency or taking away cost or improving speed or something like that. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not really radical. Then there's the other side, which is the digital transformation side. And that's really, trying to do not just the same things more efficiently, but doing different things, trying to create value for customers in new ways, new business models, disrupting competitors, going into new businesses and so forth. So that's the potential upside is much higher there, but the risk is also higher. So, I would never advise a company to put all their digital activities into the digital transformation box, right? Maybe it's 10%, maybe 50, maybe 20%. But probably not any more than that. So the risk is actually not as high as you may think. If you're doing, 80% of, we're gonna create a platform, we're gonna disrupt everybody, then you're also adopting a lot of risk. So I would not recommend that. So I think that the best thing to do is to balance the digitization and the digital transformation.
You're basically balancing your investments. You're doing more of the lower risk things, and then small level of big bets, right? So that makes sense. Now to round up this conversation, and this is a lot of things, right? These are a lot of things, and companies are thinking, okay, so now what do I do? No, and I know you mentioned there's no playbook of how to maybe do this, right? But there's a set of things that probably companies need to have in consideration. And first, you mentioned having a clear goal, not knowing where you're going to do, no, but in terms of like more practical terms, like in terms of, okay, I need to start, like I have these 3 initiatives that are very important for my company. Should I be going out to a consultant for help? Should I be building capabilities? What I mean, in practical terms, do you have any recommendation of, I know this is not like a recipe, but like 3 or 4 key things that leaders should be taking in consideration when designing this digital initiative?
Yeah, start with the objective, start with the goal. That's a really good place to start, right? And then you have to have somebody to lead it. So that's a key decision. And sometimes it's an executive that's is already in the company. And that's fine. It could be the CEO, it could be the COO, or you may decide to hire a new person or create a new role to do this. But the governance part is really important, right? That you set up governance, because if you don't set up strong governance around it, it's going to be just a million projects all going in their own direction. Every line of business, every function, every market, every product category is going to have their own digital initiatives, none of which is coordinated. And so you don't get the scale benefits. So you need to have, a program that's well supported by the top team and, with clear governance, right? And the governance doesn't need to be permanent. It's just a matter of getting everybody in the right frame of mind and getting the projects going. And then they can go back into the lines of business. But, setting up clear governance with clear objectives and goals, putting money and resources behind it is really important, right? And the process is different if it's digitization versus digital transformation, right? The stage gates are different depending on those. So setting up a program, with leadership, with governance is really, really important. You can outsource some of this, right? But for most companies, this is too important to completely outsource to a consulting company, right? You want to get help, but you want them to help you, to go back to the question earlier, to build your capabilities rather than to do it for you. You want them to help you to be able to do it so that when they leave, you don't need them anymore. So, I was talking to a chief digital officer of a big automotive company just the other day, and he said that the approach that he uses is that when he's working with an external partner, is that he starts with 70% external and 30% internal. because really the skills and the knowledge come from the external partners. They get 70% of the people and 30% internal. But over time, that reverses. So by the end of the project, it's 70% internal people and only 30% external people. So most of the knowledge and the skills have moved internally within the organization. And then you don't need the partners anymore. And then it puts you in a much stronger position to move forward.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much for your answer. Thanks for the conversation today. This has been really great, really interesting. And I still have in my head that numbers are powerful. And you say this 87% of digital transformation initiatives fail. But I also take away that there's some things you can do to reduce this risk. And I think that's been most of what we've talked about today. And it's been enlightening. So thank you very much. Michael, thank you everybody for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, at UTEC, we're very proud of having this partnership with IMD to build capabilities in people and in companies to mobilize organizations towards digital transformation, and we're proud to work together with them. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much, Michael. This has been a great conversation, and have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Enrique. Muchas gracias to you and to everyone. You mentioned my last word here. You mentioned, the 87%. That is the rate of failure in the first time, but the next time, the second time, the next generation of digital transformation, the success rate is higher, and hopefully it will continue to go up. So there's hope. Leave with a hopeful message.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Thank you.